Should you draft players in bad offenses? That more this week on the couch. Andrew Erickson, should you draft players in bad offenses?
Call me crazy, but I'm going to say no. I don't like to necessarily gravitate towards players, especially when it comes at a premium. I think that's the biggest takeaway when I look at players that are playing in offenses that we don't necessarily project as, top 10 or even above average heading into the season. And I don't think it's hard for us to identify those offenses. I looked back last year at an article I wrote, kind of taking the aggregate ADP of all the teams, and it lined up pretty well with actually how the teams ended up finishing. Now, there were a couple misses here and there, but for the most part, the market is pretty good at identifying, and we as fantasy players, as NFL bettors, are pretty good at saying, like, hey, we know which offenses are going to be good for the most part. And attaching yourselves to players on those teams gives you more outs. So not necessarily if this player doesn't look great on paper from, a target share perspective, how the targets are going to kind of play out with, crowded offense. The thing that bails out fantasy players and like receivers specifically is touchdowns. Like that's what bails you out. And who scores more touchdowns is the better offenses. So, one of the players last year that I kind of just didn't have enough shares of or exposure to was like Mike Evans. And because he didn't look good from like a projection standpoint, but it didn't matter because he played in the best pass heavy offense in the NFL and he has double-digit touchdown upside every single season just based on his profile. So for me, it's yes, there's opportunities to take players that project well because they're the only show in town on some of these worse offenses, but you don't want to pay a premium for those guys. Like you can get those guys so much later, like a Brandin Cooks last year. He would routinely go in the 8th round. Like that's where I want to take my shots on some of these guys that aren't on these good prolific offenses where when you're at the top of the draft, like locking and loading yourselves and investing in these better offenses is just a better recipe for success.
Yes, and it's just that simple, right? Andrew Erickson, by the way, folks, if you don't know him, Fantasy Pros, sharp. Is it okay if I say you're a rising star, Andrew?
Yes.
I don't want to
I
make you
love
blush.
that.
I don't want to make you blush, man. Andrew Erickson with a K and an underscore at the end, like a little diving board. Let's dive in. Yeah, look, this is a high-level sorter. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So when I saw your thread yesterday, serendipity as we're now talking about this on the couch, but I wanted to really highlight it because I think it's a high-level way to look at fantasy football that actually works and makes sense. And I there's a lot of studies and data diving we could do, Andrew, to prove it. But do you really need to prove that it's better for players to be in good offenses and it's worse to be in bad offenses? Efficiency, we throw around the word efficiency a lot. High efficiency offenses, low efficiency offenses. We can get into, volume and points and things like that. But I think of it like soil. And it's rich. I'm down here in New Orleans. We have the richest soil in the country. Yeah, I'm going to talk up New Orleans. It's a show. I'm a New Orleans guy. If you put things in the ground here, they grow and grow and grow and grow, Andrew. And that's a good offense, right? We might not know which plants get planted. There might be injuries. There might be ambiguity about split backfields or pecking orders and targets. But a good offense is going to create overachievers, and a bad offense is going to create underachievers.
Yeah, and it makes sense, intuitively. You don't need to overthink. We have so much data now that we didn't have, 10 years ago when we're looking at fantasy football, and it's almost going full circle. It's kind of like the complex of all of the streaming services that we now have. It takes me forever, it seems like, to figure out what I want to watch. And it's almost like I would rather just have a simple formula where you just watch this one thing as opposed to, well, now I got to check Netflix. Now I got to check Paramount Plus. Now I got to check Hulu. Like, which of these streaming services do I want to use tonight? Where it's kind of the same thing with fantasy, where it's like, which, next gen stat are you going to look at? And you could just be like, just kind of zoom out and say, I just want guys in good offenses.
Yeah.
And it can really be that simple. And I think the case, and I look back at my misses from last year, and that's kind of how I kind of came to this mindset where my biggest misses last year were all on players that played on bad offenses. And I was, going to bat because, I believe in the talent. The talent is going to outdo the situation. And I think from a dynasty perspective, I think that is the right approach. But on a 1-year sample size, betting on DJ Moore to overcome the atrocity in Carolina was just never going to work out. And not to say that DJ Moore was a bad player, but Cooper Kupp, if you drafted DJ Moore, you probably didn't have Cooper Kupp last year because they were kind of going in a similar range. And even though Moore was, again, a solid fantasy wide receiver too, like that's the upside with even the best players on these bottom 10 offenses. They just don't have the same upside that you get when you have a quarterback and a coaching staff that wants to throw the ball out, that wants to be aggressive on third downs and on fourth downs. And those are the teams that just score the most fantasy points. So I think that when in doubt, especially like from a tiebreaker standpoint, it's always better to just lean on the guy that is in the better offense, not necessarily the guy that quote unquote projects better on paper. Because as we see, there's so much turnover and attrition at the different positions. People get hurt, people step into roles. And then there are the occasional teams that do come out of the woodwork that we weren't expecting to be good offenses. And that's really kind of where the question marks become when you're in that middle range, where, will the Jaguars be a good offense? Like that's a question mark that you can bring up. There are a couple offenses I kind of pointed out in the article that I wrote that were kind of on the fringe. They were outside the top 16 based on the market's perception, but I could see a scenario where they do step up. The Giants are another offense that kind of comes to mind where I see the path where they can be an above average offense, but they're all going super late. So those are the bets I want to make. Whereas some of the offenses I feel pretty strongly about, whether it's the Texans or the Jets offense, where I really feel strongly about them not being, above average offenses. Like I'm okay with, or Seattle specifically. Like I don't want to do the research to figure out how DK Metcalf is going to perform in an offense led by Geno Smith and Drew Lock. Like I know the splits with Geno Smith looked good last year, but are we really going to buy a small sample size with Metcalf, with Geno Smith for like 3 games and extrapolate it over a 17-game season and be like, oh yeah, he'll be fine. I think that the he'll be fine is a great litmus test of, I don't want my players to be fine. I want my players to explode, to be unlocked, to go to the next level. Is the offensive situation that they're in doing that for them? And if not, I'm going to be lower on those players naturally.
Yeah, it is very intuitive and very simple. And like you said, the simplest way to use it is a tiebreaker, but also it should just affect your perception. I've always felt, Andrew, that the fact that we draft a player or the name of a player, really it's just the tip of the iceberg. And what we're drafting is an intersection between all these relationships, right? You're not even drafting a wide receiver. You're drafting the quarterback wide receiver combination, which then implicates the offensive line and the coaches and so many other things. And a real good high-level sorter is the quality of the offense. Now, someone said when you and I were talking about this yesterday on Twitter, well, okay, but how easy is it to pick the best offenses? And I think it's actually pretty easy. I think if any of us put together a list of our projected top 10 offenses, 7 or 8 of them will be in the top 10. Let's do a real quick exercise, Andrew. Let's just point out, because there's layers to this, right? Like you said, there's the offenses you want to avoid, there's the offenses you want to target, and then there's the in-between offenses where you're not sure. I would almost put those in a category of pay close attention when the season starts and make an action with confidence based on the early indicators, because there's a wider range of outcomes for those offenses. And maybe there's some top-end range of outcomes that we're interested in. But real quick, Buffalo, good offense, yes?
Yes.
Kansas City?
Yes.
Denver?
Yes.
Chargers?
Yes.
Now, does Devontae Adams put Vegas on this list?
Yeah, I think so. It was interesting looking back last year, the Raiders were ranked really low. They were outside the top 25 in terms of ADP, and Devontae Adams has obviously changed that a lot. And the fact that Derek Carr, I think, is kind of in a similar mold to Kirk Cousins, just, underrated passer. He can put up back-end fantasy QB1 numbers, and now he has the best receiver he's ever had. That's someone that should unlock his upside, with touchdowns especially. So, yeah, I'd put the Raiders up there.
Cincinnati?
Yep.
Dallas?
Yeah, so Dallas seems like the candidate that is viewed as a top offense that could fall out of becoming a top offense.
Okay. Do we project Philadelphia as a top offense?
I would say so. Yeah.
I think so too. Green Bay?
Yeah.
Minnesota?
Yes. I actually think Minnesota is one of the, from like a best ball perspective, like the Vikings are a team that it's like the easiest team to stack together. Basically, in round 1, you draft Dalvin Cook or Justin Jefferson, and then every other player you can just get at draft cost. Like you don't need to reach for Kirk Cousins. You don't need to reach for Irv Smith or KJ Osborne, Alexander Madison. Like those guys all kind of come pretty late. And the way that you look at their offense, bringing in Kevin O'Connell from the Rams, if he
Right.
implements a offensive system and philosophy like the Rams have had the last 2 seasons, I mean, we're going to see the Vikings pass more than ever and
Right.
not really see. And they're super cheap. They play in a dome. They play against other good offenses. They have offensive playmakers around them. So the Vikings are a team that I think we could be talking about next year and just during the season as an offense that, oh my God, like how do we not see this coming? This Vikings offense
Right.
is on fire.
Right. I'm fascinated with the teams that it can't get worse and it could get a lot better, like Jacksonville, you mentioned the Giants, Chicago to an extent. Minnesota is kind of in that category, even though we don't think of them because it wasn't bad. It was
Right.
just Mike Zimmer and his philosophy really might have been holding the team back. And Kevin O'Connell might bring that offense more into the 21st century. And I mean, again, this is that high level sorter. If you're looking at Irv Smith late, maybe it's a nudge to take him. Tampa Bay, I mean, I think that's even without Rob Gronkowski.
Yeah.
Um, Arizona,
Yeah, I would say so. I
yeah,
still think that when Murray's healthy and they should get Hopkins back, I think that they're still even if
yeah,
even if they're not as good as they should be,
right,
they're still an
exactly.
above average
That's
offense.
that's a perfect way to put it. That's a perfect way to put it because you do think like Arizona should be better than they are, but at the same time, that doesn't mean they're not a good offense or a multiplier for fantasy players. The Rams, as long as Matthew Stafford's elbow doesn't blow up. San Francisco,
Yeah, from an
yeah, I think so.
efficiency
Yeah,
standpoint, they just every year.
a lot better too. I mean, we'll see about the big reveal. And I guess that's about it. I mean, Matt Ryan's going to make Indianapolis better, but I don't think it's a fantasy multiplier offense.
No, I would probably put them as like an average, just kind of in
Right,
the middle
right. And
offense.
Baltimore, Greg Roman, I get a kind of feeling of dread actually.
I would probably say Baltimore's probably going to be a good offense. I mean, when they had Lamar healthy last year, they were in first place. It was when he got hurt, just the wheels
Yeah,
totally fell
that's
off
fair.
the
That's
team.
fair.
So I would probably lean towards being above consensus on the Ravens.
I worry not to make this into a detour to the Ravens. I just worry. I think the NFL knows Greg Roman. I'll just go off on a tangent here. It's a football show, but I'm going to talk about baseball. I'm watching a ton of baseball. 9-year-old. I'm coaching youth baseball. The season just ended. It's crazy. It's a trip. And baseball's different than football in that there's that one confrontation between the pitcher and the batter, right? And that drives everything. Whereas in football, there's 11 confrontations, and there's all kinds of variables. And there is a pitcher batter confrontation in football, and it's the coordinators, right? I mean, in some ways, like a coordinator and a play caller dials up a pitch, and the batter, or really this was like Justice Mosqueda, preventer versus creator kind of narrative. Who, I guess the defense is the preventer. And I guess in this case, I don't know, is the pitcher the preventer? My point is that the coaches and how the pitch the coach dials up or what pitch they're looking for, whether they're able to hit it hard, is going to affect fantasy outcomes. And I just worry, Andrew, about Greg Roman. I feel like teams know his pitching tendencies, even if it's still a 100-mile heater with Lamar Jackson, you can hit a 100-mile heater really far it's like what happens in the playoffs to the Ravens every year, right? When the screws get tighter. But you're probably right. We should be more optimistic about them. So you have these offenses, and it's so easy to break ties in favor of players in these offenses. And whether we're talking about which backup running backs to take, whether we're talking about which upside tight end to take late in your draft, which you should. And then you mentioned the offenses that are, and by the way, check out Andrew again, check out his Twitter and read the whole thread because you actually give actionable advice and say, here are some players that I'm targeting under this theory. But you also say, hey, there are a few players because we started off with should you draft players of bad offenses? In any fantasy football strategy, it's never the right answer to be absolute. You mentioned Brandin Cooks. Give me the outlook of Brandin Cooks and maybe a few other players that makes them a player that at ADP still is worth targeting, even though they're in a bad offense.
Yeah, so Brandin Cooks, Darnell Mooney, these types of players that project really well from a target share perspective. Like they should be the alpha receivers in their offenses. Brandin Cooks has a long track record of putting up production, regardless of who he's been on. 4 or 5 different teams at this point. He's always been a top 20 wide receiver. He got it done last year with Davis Mills during a rookie year and Tyrod Taylor. And even when Davis Mills came back as the starter in the second half of the season, Brandin Cooks was putting up, fringe wide receiver 1 numbers. Now, I don't always like betting on these small sample sizes because Davis Mills could come out and just not be a good quarterback. That's totally still in his range of outcomes. But you're not paying a lot to get Brandin Cooks on your team. But it's also important to keep in mind that Brandin Cooks, because of the offensive environment he does play in, he's not going to be someone that we look back and be like, Brandin Cooks was a league winner. No, that's probably not the case. He's going to be a value pick, like someone that's reliable week to week. And I think that's important to note. You just don't see league winning players come from bad offenses, just in general, because the upside is just naturally capped because you have to score touchdowns. Like, look at all the top scorers from last year. They were all scoring 18, 19, 20 touchdowns. Like James Conner scored 18 touchdowns last year. Like, that's why he was a league winner, not because of his ability as a rusher or the workload that he got. It's because he was scoring touchdowns even when Chase Edmonds was healthy. So the touchdowns are kind of like your cheat code in terms of unlocking the upside and potential of your players. And the map to finding the path to touchdowns is through the offenses. And that's not something that's really hard to identify. So the more darts you take on these offensive players in good environments, the better chance you have of hitting. So I think it's important to note from a roster construction standpoint, I wouldn't feel comfortable, for example, like taking Deontay Johnson and Darnell Mooney and Brandin Cooks.
Right.
Like I would be sweating. That would be a strategy I would not recommend. Like if you want to take one of those guys because you're like, I want one of these guys to be my consistent, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 every single week. Like, okay, that makes sense. And even from a PPR standpoint versus a standard or half point PPR, play volume can help make up for a lack of efficiency. Playing in a PPR gives players that play in bad offenses more of a fighting chance because they just need to get volume, where it's less important about efficiency because touchdowns are more dependent when it's a half-point PPR scoring or a standard scoring. So I think that at the right price, those guys become values, but there are still players that you can get that are projected to lead their team in target, like Jacoby Myers. He is a guy that is free. Like he goes in the 12th, 13th round because people are unsure of how the Patriots' targets are going to play out. I still think it's going to be Jacoby Myers. He's been the guy there the last 2 years. I've seen, as a Patriots, someone that follows the Patriots very closely, I've seen the Devontae Parker experiment play out multiple times. Like with these veteran guys that the Patriots trade for and signed during training camp, and they never played down for the Patriots. Like I would even go as far as saying that Parker has as good a chance of leading the team in targets as he has of getting cut from the team entirely. Like I've seen them sign these big-bodied guys past their prime, and they just fizzle out. Whereas Jacoby Myers is still a young player, and all he's done in his first 2 years is command targets at a high rate. So I think that shouldn't be overlooked, and that's the value in looking for those types of players. Because they play on bad offenses, you can get them much cheaper, even like a Christian Kirk. Is there really a massive difference between, Kirk leading the Jaguars in targets who should throw the ball a ton versus a Darnell Mooney with the Bears, with Brandin Cooks at the Texans? The only difference is the cost. It's so much cheaper. And then if Kirk doesn't pan out, you just cut him and move on. It doesn't cost you anything to draft those types of players.
Yeah, I like the concept. I think Chad Parsons on our staff, he referred to it, the thing I talk about a lot. I called it early reveal. Like it's valuable to take players with a wide season range of outcomes, and then the first week or two, you have a pretty good idea which half at least you're on, and you can move on quickly. And then taking those shots on the early waiver wire is important. If you have a lot of players, young players that you believe in, but the opportunity isn't there early in the season, then you can absolutely lose opportunity to improve your roster. And the early reveal, you mentioned Christian Kirk. Just real quick, I'll add on Kirk. The one thing I worry about him is they're paying him like a number one. He is their number one. And I just, it kind of reminds me of Corey Davis last year. We'll see how that pans out. I like the way that you're bringing up these players that Jacoby Myers, New England, throw a dart. But I want to drill down on New England because you're up in Massachusetts. We were talking about this before we went live. Okay. what are your vibes here? Or you can also say vibes. I don't care about vibes. That's not part of my fantasy football process. But Joe Judge and Matt Patricia and Bill Belichick running. Is this some sort of bad Disney movie, where they run the offense? There's Belichick taking snapping the ball to Mac Jones. There's all this optimism. Evan Lazar put something out this morning that makes it sound like it's going to be more Shanahan, outside zone concepts. Like the dinosaur actually is roaring awakening. And I mean, this is life after Tom Brady, right? This is what life after Tom Brady looks like. But do you think they can pull this off? Is this a potential negative efficiency offense as they're trying to be all nimble and young and get their groove back?
I think that the market is overvaluing this coaching scenario playing out because we don't know. Like people are acting like, at least the market is acting based on ADP, that I collected looking
Sure.
at the aggregate. The Patriots are last, like 32nd. When you average their players together being drafted, no team is going later in drafts than the New England Patriots. And that blows my mind because they were a top 10 team in terms of EPA per dropback last season. Like they were a top 10 efficiency offense last year. They were top 10 in scoring offense last year. So, yes, there's question marks about, which pieces are going to be doing the scoring. Like that's why they're all going super, super late. But there's no cost associated with drafting any of these players. And in this case, you can draft guys that have talent. Jacoby Myers, like I mentioned before, Kendrick Bourne showed a lot of talent, and he didn't even play as a full-time starter last year. He could see his snaps increase. So you're not necessarily looking at a player that, thrived on a small sample size, but someone that now has an increased role because of how well he played. You have Jonnu Smith, who, when he was on the field, they did target him a lot, but he just wasn't playing enough. And is that going to change? I would bet on probably. Like, it can only go up. Like, he can't play less than he did last year.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume that he can only play more. I mean, if Jonnu Smith is going to finish as like the 30th tight end in fantasy again, like I just would be very shocked by that. So I think that the Patriots are screaming buys, especially at like with Rhamondre Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that he's someone that, I always go to the Patriots training camps to get an idea of how players are being used. And, I see it through obviously a different lens than, a beat reporter does, where they're just trying to report on the team. Like I'm looking at it strictly from a fantasy perspective. Like who are they throwing the ball into the red zone all the time? And last year in training camp, that guy was Hunter Henry. And what do you know? Who led the team in touchdowns? Oh, it was Hunter Henry. So that didn't shock me. So I'm excited to go to training camp and watch Stevenson and be like, all right, what are they doing on third downs? Is he out there on third downs catching passes from Mac Jones? Like, is that legitimate? Because we've heard some rumors coming out about that. And if that's fact and that's the case, like I'm just gonna draft Stevenson, over Damian Harris, 2 rounds later. Like I just won't touch Damian Harris because if he's gonna be splitting work on early downs with Stevenson, but Stevenson has work in the passing game and has the upside if Damian Harris misses any games as a 3-down workhorse like we saw last year. I mean, Stevenson, just the fact that he was able to not only get out of the Bill Belichick doghouse after the first half of the season, but then perform super well. He was one of PFF's highest graded running backs from week 9 on. He was basically splitting touches 50-50 with Damian Harris as a day 3 rookie running back who those types of players notoriously under Bill Belichick have literally been zeros. They've never been able to play, have just always been redshirted. Basically, unless you were a first-round running back like a Lawrence Maroney or Sony Michel in the Patriots system historically, like you never played. Like you never saw the field at all. And Rhamondre Stevenson has been the one exception of a player to actually do so. So I think that the talent with him is so apparent. He's a bigger running back, which we don't have a lot of big guys like that in today's NFL. So he's special to me and someone that I just can't stop necessarily taking shots on in the later rounds.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, love drilling down on Stevenson because you point out, I love the way you point out the stark difference. I remember going into training camp last year, roster 53 projections and things like that. Oh, well, Stevenson's probably going to be a redshirt year. Typical. Damian Harris basically had a redshirt year. I mean, their backfield wasn't performing that well. We're wondering, when are they going to give Damian Harris some sort of rookie opportunity? They just, by the structure, almost by edict, don't. And Rhamondre Stevenson, with Ivan Fear's tough love, there's some tough love, but hey, he rose above. And the talent, like you said, Stevenson himself said, I'm working on route running and third down back skills. So if we take him, I don't think he's playing some deep subterfuge game here. And the opportunity for him just to be a third down back in PPR leagues, especially if he's 12th round pick. I mean, that could James White might not, indications are, be ready for the beginning of the season if Stevenson's the third down back. And then you have Damian Harris, who's certainly very competent, but just doesn't have the juice that Stevenson has. And if we're talking about more outside zone running, although the thing is, you mentioned aggregate ADP, and I really like that you refer to that. Here's how I use aggregate ADP this time of year, Andrew. I like to look at, and people talk about things in these terms often. If there's 3 wide receivers projected in the top 40 wide receivers, what's the quarterback projected? Does the market actually agree with itself, or is there tension in the market? When you look at how the market is placing value, there's going to be some that jump out at you that something's wrong here. I don't know necessarily which direction it's wrong, but there's no way that this ADP is rational at this position if this is the ADP of this corresponding player at the team at another position. But I like the idea of adding that up to, you almost have when you say aggregate ADP, just like signing some sort of rough value to ADP and just adding up the total per team.
Yeah, so I did it in 2 different ways. So I took one exercise I did was basically just taking the average of all the players that had an ADP basically within, the top 18 rounds of drafts and aggregated those. And then I did another one where I just took the top 7 players from each team, because I didn't want some of the teams. So for example, like the Buccaneers, they had the most players being drafted. 17 players. So a lot of those guys are last round picks. So people are taking shots on, Scotty Miller, Tyler Johnson, Cameron Brate, those types of players. And I didn't want that suppressing the Buccaneers' offensive value. So I wanted to make sure I was looking at the top 7 players from each team as well to kind of compare and contrast between just taking all the players. And it's interesting because the Buccaneers are number 1 with the most drafted players at 17. The Chiefs are number 2 at 14. And then tied with the Chiefs are the team we just talked about, the New England Patriots at 14. So, but it couldn't be totally, it's so different because 2 of those teams we talked about at the top of the show, great offenses, like no doubt. And then the Patriots just have 14 guys being drafted, but they're all going super, super late. So the market is telling us that there is definitely intrigue by the Patriots, but no one is willing to really pay up for anything with the Patriots. And that's why I think it's you find your guys you like on the Patriots. Like, I like Rhamondre Stevenson. I like Jacoby Myers. Like, those are the guys I'm drafting. And it costs literally nothing to get them on your team. And it's where now you can actually have like a player take. Like, I want to have Stevenson because I like what I saw from him last year. So that's why I'm drafting him. So any of these Patriots players, whether you think that it can be Tyquan Thornton, you think that his speed can be the guy, like, you should take him with his last round pick. Like, there is going to be appeal with this Patriots offense because they showed us last year with Mac Jones as a rookie quarterback, they could be a top 10 scoring offense, and that's going to make fantasy points. And I think that it's being overblown, the coaching scenario in New England, when why can't Mac Jones just take over the offense? They gave Brady control of the offense, and he was doing a lot, calling plays at the line of scrimmage. Mac Jones is a supercomputer. Like, that's what his claim to fame was coming out of Alabama. It's not like he's been in this offense isn't that much different than it was in Alabama. He's been in this system for a long time. So for me, I'm taking all the discounts that this coaching narrative is kind of creating for us, for the Patriots players. And look, I remember when Joe Brady was going to save Sam Darnold last year. Like we overblow these. The coaches don't play. The coaches coach, and the players play. And Mac Jones showed that he was good last year. So that's why I have confidence that these Patriots can definitely easily beat their ADP because they're all free right now.
Yeah, and it does reflect the uncertainty, though. I'm glad that you brought up that there are a lot of Patriots getting drafted. It's just they're all being drafted late because of a sense of a limited ceiling, or in some cases uncertainty, right? You've got Stevenson and Harris both being drafted. And I mean, Harris was a great value last year. I mean, taking both Stevenson and Harris is defensible. The one pitfall there is if they really are doing more outside zone, then maybe that gives you a key to unlock Pierre Strong. And if they're really willing to use running backs, and we get into a 4-back backfield maybe when James White is healthy with wide receivers. Kendrick Bourne and Mac Jones seem to be on the same page. You also have, you mentioned Devontae Parker, Tyquan Thornton, and then you even have 2 tight ends. So that's part of why, and an aggregate ADP perspective, they might be lower because they all represent not very expensive gambles, but that's why you should be interested. let's, I like this idea of looking at things on an offense level perspective. And you brought up the Jets earlier. And I'm curious what you think about the Jets, because I feel like it's all really what you think about Zach Wilson. You might have a strong take on Brees Hall. You might have a strong take on Garrett Wilson as a talent, Elijah Moore as a talent. But it's hard to get the image, Andrew, out of my head of, Mike White and Joe Flacco make this offense look functional, but Zach Wilson doesn't. And how then to take that into what about the darts in the Jets offense? Another offense, with the exception of Brees Hall, you don't really have to pay up for anybody. Even Brees Hall, for the number one running back off the board in the draft, it's not that expensive compared historically to what you have to pay for that commodity. How do you feel about the Jets?
Yeah, so the Jets were interesting because their average ADP was actually not in the bottom 10. So they weren't being viewed as a bottom 10 offense by the aggregate ADP, and that's why you don't like a lot of them aren't really that cheap. I think Brees Hall is definitely a good example of a cheaper player, but Elijah Moore isn't a free square. Like, you have to draft him in like the 6th or 7th round because he showed us a lot of talent last year. Garrett Wilson was a first round pick. You have Corey Davis there, who's under contract and should be playing a lot of snaps. But then you have Zach Wilson going super, super late. And that's kind of where the inconsistencies are with the Jets, because if all these Jets players are being drafted in the top 100 picks, like, why isn't Zach Wilson higher? And it's because he was horrible last year, and it was really, really bad. And it's really hard to find a lot of good. Now, I know that he improved a little bit down the stretch. He was taking care of the football a lot more when he came back from his injury, but it's weird because you'd think that, you mentioned Joe Flacco, Mike White, and that's not something we just saw with Zach Wilson. We saw a lot of these, journeyman veteran quarterbacks actually create better fantasy environments for their receivers than the rookie quarterbacks did. It was very bizarre in that way, where, you had Tyler Huntley coming in and he was fine, helping Mark Andrews. So there is I almost think that, I'm looking at some of these teams that are projecting to have rookie quarterbacks, and it's like, I think we probably, if you're Kyle Pitts, like if you're investing Kyle Pitts, like you may want Mariota to be the starter there. Like, just historically speaking, like the rookie quarterbacks coming in have just been so much worse in terms of creating fantasy options. And not even because, they're winning more games, nor they're throwing for less yards, but they're just not either as concentrated on just going to one player. They're trying to be more conservative, where if you're a veteran quarterback, you kind of can do with what the defense kind of gives you. And you don't necessarily need to worry about like winning or losing games. You're kind of just out there, like, you just go sling it. Like, just do whatever you want. Like, it doesn't really matter what you do. That's kind of what we saw from Mike White and Joe Flacco last year, when they were able to actually like produce a Jets offense because there was no pressure on them. They were just like, go out and play. Like, we don't really care what you do. Whereas Zach Wilson, okay, entering year 2 now, he has like this boatload of pressure on him to then support all of these Jets options. So I guess the way I see it is, it's either going to be Brees Hall or like no one that really ends up being a fantasy factor here. Because if it's Wilson out there with Corey Davis and Elijah Moore, it's going to be really hard to parse between like which of these guys is going to get the majority of targets in this offense. And then you ask, okay, well, how many touchdown opportunities is this offense even going to get? Like, that's the other thing with them. So I'm fine with, if I come away without drafting a Jet, in my draft, like, so be it. Like, I just don't think that looking back on the draft and be like, man, I drafted no Jets, like, that's going to kill me in the upcoming season. That's just going to totally end me. I'd feel that way if I didn't draft like any Chargers players or what, any Bucks players. Like, those are the picks you're going to regret more often. But, Brees Hall beating you, or Elijah Moore beating you because you don't draft him in the 7th round because he's on the Jets, like, that's probably not going to happen. And I think that one of these guys could probably hit, just because there is some talent there. I do like Brees Hall in the 4th round, and Elijah Moore pointed out, was really productive towards the end of last year when he was healthy. But it's probably only going to be one guy. And I think that that's the thing to keep in mind. Like, I would be shy of overloading my teams with a lot of Jets players, and be mindful that if you do draft a Jets player, like, make that the investment that you're investing into a bad offense. Like, make that one player investment. Don't be, drafting a bunch of running backs on bad teams, because, Brees Hall can hit as long as he's involved in the passing game. Like, that's the cheat code with these bad offensive running backs, where, okay, Brees Hall's touchdowns might be limited, but he's catching all the catches out of the backfield when the Jets are trailing in games. So if he has that role, which I think that he will have, but, Michael Carter is a pass catching running back. We didn't actually exactly see Zach Wilson pepper running backs with targets last year. It's still a question mark about his profile. So we could end up seeing Breece Hall just being a middling RB2 based on volume, and his receiving role is and he's not scoring touchdowns. So ultimately, he's not necessarily a league winner for you,
Right.
in the fourth round.
Yeah, I have league winner again to go back and touch on. One takeaway, and we don't ever want to be too overbroad, but your slogan here is league winners don't come out of bad offenses, or even alternatively, league winners come out of good offenses. And these other offenses, you're bottom feeding. I like it. I mean, my favorite targets on the Jets draft wise, Andrew, are Corey Davis, because he's still the number one receiver and he's the cheapest. I mean, he had some rapport with Zach Wilson when the play broke down last year. If I'm going to throw a dart, a cheap dart, and Michael Carter, who showed last year that he's hashtag good at football, and we're projecting Breece Hall to do a lot of things and be not just an obstacle to Carter's value, but a creator of the best value in the backfield. When Carter is the one who's actually already shown he can do that, and this coaching staff knows that he can do that, there's a lot of stuff between here and there where what's Carter right now? What, I don't even know, 13th, 14th, 15th round pick. I mean, I don't think he's very expensive. And if Breece Hall doesn't start to create buzz in training camp, if Breece Hall gets hurt and misses training camp practices, and Carter's running with the ones, all of a sudden you have a great value on your hand. And if it's Breece Hall, then you toss Carter to the side, although I don't think he's going to be tossed to the side that easily. Out of these other offenses, you're looking more for your targets later on that might have been overlooked because of the offense they're in. I want to touch on a couple more offenses. This 30,000 foot view, Andrew. Okay. What about Miami? This is an AFC East show. What about Miami? Because you have Mike McDaniel, and this is 6 offensive coordinators in 5 years. But you bring up Tua and Marcus Mariota, who also had this situation. But it ended up once the Tennessee got a good offensive coordinator, it just wasn't good with Mariota. And then Brian Tannehill, the reject from Miami, ironically, becomes $100 million quarterback. That story takes interesting turns. But Tua is kind of halfway into Mariota's rookie career. I mean, his rookie contract, basically, in terms of his arc. So is Mike McDaniel going to be a savior? Is Tua going to be a savior? You also have Tyreek Hill. So now the field is starting to really tilt. They get Teron Armstead. The field is really starting to tilt in the favor of this offense. But it, again, like with Zach Wilson, it all comes down to Tua. Or does it? Because Mike McDaniel showed in San Francisco that his offenses can make the quarterback more incidental to the success of the offense. They just have to execute. What do you think about Miami?
Yeah, I lean towards the latter there, where I think Tua is going to be kind of tasked in a role where he's set up, he's kind of prompted up to succeed, because of the system around him in a similar way to how we saw Jimmy Garoppolo. And the thing with Garoppolo is, for however his yards per attempt, how great it was, every single season he was playing, the guy never was putting up fantasy numbers. It didn't really make a lot of sense because you look at him and be like, how does he lead the NFL in yards per attempt? And have these great efficiency numbers, and then you look at his fantasy numbers and they're all horrible. And it's like, oh well, he throws a lot of dumb interceptions, and they just didn't let him throw the ball enough. They were a run, first offense. They've been a run first offense, and that's one of the things with the 49ers that I think that their overall offense with Trey Lance is kind of being overvalued because all those QB runs, all of those rushes just take away opportunities from the receivers. Every rushing attempt is taking away from my passing attempt. And, the Miami Dolphins, what's not talked about enough about the Dolphins with Tua the last 2 years when he's been playing, Miami's been one of the most pass-heavy offenses in the NFL over the last 2 seasons. And yet Tua hasn't crested more than 15 fantasy points per game. He's had the ideal system around him in terms of a up-tempo offense that's going to throw the ball a lot. And yet he really didn't do anything with it. And the thing that I always get fooled by, and this happened to me last year, again, kind of going back to last year, what mistakes I made. Daniel Jones looked really good on the deep ball from a metric standpoint, from efficiency standpoint, because he didn't throw the deep ball at all. The small sample size deep ball trap was Daniel Jones last year. So when they signed Kenny Golladay, I thought it was a good fit because Kenny Golladay was a downfield threat. But I think it's more telling of a quarterback and how their coaches feel about them going downfield is, how often are you actually throwing the ball downfield?
Yeah.
That's really more of an indication of how good they are instead of these, because that's a small sample size. All deep passes are a small sample size because quarterbacks aren't going deep, 10 to 15 times per game. it's 2 to 3 times per game. And for the most part, we know who the good deep ball passers are. Mahomes, Justin Herbert. Like, you can name them off the cuff because you don't have any question marks about it, because they have a rocket arm. Josh Allen. Like, I don't need to look at the stats to know who has a good deep ball and who doesn't, and who coaches trust to attack downfield. And so far throughout his career, that guy has not been Tua. Tua has been the distributor, getting the ball quick out of his hands, getting into his playmakers' hands. And that obviously has value, but at least in the 49ers offense that we've seen before play out, that doesn't translate to fantasy value. I do think ultimately that one of these Dolphins is going to hit, whether it be a Tyreek Hill or a Jalen Waddle, but it's so much to pay for a guy like Tyreek Hill in round 2 when his quarterback is worse than it was last year. Like, it's going back to is his quarterback unlocking him, or are we looking at Tyreek Hill? Oh, he'll be fine with Tua. Like, I don't want my quarterback or my receivers to be fine with their quarterbacks. I want them to be unlocked, unleashed, hitting their top tier potential. And that's not the case. And the fact that Hill has to come out, I think that he's being a good teammate, defending Tua. But dude, like, if you need to keep saying it over and over and over again, that doesn't make it true. Like, if anything, you're making it seem like it's not true, because if it was so true, it would be blatantly obvious. Like, you wouldn't have to explain it to your, live Twitch stream that, oh, no, Tua, I'd rather have him as my quarterback. He's more accurate. It's like, come on. Like, no one is buying that, okay, maybe more accurate from 0 to 9 yards down the field. Like, what good is that going to do? And I think Hill will have games. He'll have spike weeks, similar to Waddle, but I'd rather take the discount on Waddle as a ascending talent on a Dolphins offense that I don't think will necessarily be a bad offense overall. But Hill is just really expensive to pay for, and there's just still a lot of question marks. And I know after week 1, I almost inevitably know I'm going to feel like a dummy, because Hill's going to get like 15 targets in their first game. And I'm just going to be like, I think it's going to level out as they kind of realize that, they can't just check the ball down to Tyreek Hill, on so many different plays. And look, McDaniel came from he was the run game coordinator. Like, why are we assuming he's going to then like implement this like super complicated passing attack with a lot of mouths to feed? I remember it used to be, Sig, now correct me if I'm wrong. Remember when we used to have quarterbacks like take another step in their second season with an offensive coordinator? Like, what happened to that? Like now it's just like, nope, like, new OC comes in, like, everything should hit. We should be firing on all cylinders at week 1. The Dolphins play the Patriots and Ravens first 2 weeks of the season. Like, are you going to start Tua in your leagues in those matchups? Like, probably not. Like, I'm not going to feel good about it. So Tua's a guy I'm not drafting, and I'm shying away from a lot of those pieces. I mean, if anything, I like the backfield more. I like Edmonds is cheap.
Yep.
Sony Michel.
That's where I was going with this. Yes.
Yeah, Sony Michel. I mean, if you look at that backfield, like, who is the only running back on that team that is actually have a proven 3-down workhorse profile? And that's Sony Michel.
Yeah, it's really, there's a lot of good things to sift through here. Okay. First of all, where you started with Tua and Jimmy Garoppolo and yards per attempt, and you mentioned Daniel Jones too. Sometimes these efficiency stats can be a stat that measures the offense and not the player, even though we assign it to the player. And it's just that the Shanahan offense was good. And it makes sense, right? If you have a lower pass volume and you pick your spots and you set up your spots, you're going to be more successful. That doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, but volume-wise tells us that the coach trusts that player and wants that element of that player to be a big or bigger than average part of the offense. That's where you want to get in. Tua is not going to have a higher than average number of deep balls. And I think Waddle over Hill is a layup. I mean, like, I don't like to speak too much in absolutes, but that's a layup to me. I think they're similar as a fantasy outlook players. I think hopefully the offense should treat them as interchangeable. If this offense is rational, treat these guys as interchangeable, make the defense make choices, and then let Tua make these binary choices based on how the defense handles having to defend Waddle and Hill. But I also like how you talked about Hill's ADP in the second round. One of the things I like to do at this time of year is look at the ADP last year, look at the ADP this year. Well, it should change, right? His ADP should be lower. But has it dropped in a way that is in proportion to how much lower we think it should be? Well, it hasn't dropped very much at all. Nah. Going from Mahomes, and like you said, he's trying to sell it. Bad indicator when he's trying to sell us on the idea. Look, man, we're not stupid. We have eyes. There's no universe where you'd rather have Tua thrown to you than Patrick Mahomes. The same Tua that all the Alabama receivers said they'd rather have Mac Jones throwing to them, right? So now we get into the math
Exactly.
where Mahomes is less than Mac. No, sorry. And some of the stuff that's come out of KC, even some of the stuff where Hill is kind of telling on himself by how outspoken he is, almost shades of Antonio Brown. Sorry, as a Steelers fan, I feel like I'm allowed to go there, where it's like the trade might not have been just about money. I don't know if the trade was just about money, if he was calling up his agent and throwing a fit about how many targets he's getting and his stats. I don't know. A lot of things to look at, but I love the analysis lens of look at the ADP last year, look at it this year. What has changed? Does the ADP reflect that change in your opinion, the way that you would reflect it? And these are ways you find your draft targets. And very simply, Hill's not a target. Maybe Waddle is, maybe not, but it's probably going to be a boring offense. If things go well, it's going to be a boring offense. That's Sony Michel. He's a boring player, right? Boring and boring. It's perfect. They're in concert. And Raheem Mostert, love him, never holds up. Chase Edmonds has utility, but maybe not as your bread and butter guy in a running game where the running game is going to set the tone. I don't love Sony Michel as a player, but I think he is set up to knock his ADP out of the park because he lines up with, look what he did with the Rams. He came over and they had to make some changes to the system and simplify it, but he's that guy that coaches can go to sleep at night knowing Sony Michel is their backup running back. He's going to be assignment sound. He's been there, done that, like you said. So lots of cool things to go through here. And maybe two of the things that I emphasize a lot, one is looking at the schedule, and you think about hot starts, you think about what we're going to learn early, and think about that as far as the attractiveness of drafting a player. Because you talked about those Jets. My Lord,
oh my
the Jets.
God, it's horrible.
It's horrible. It's the whole AFC North, and then Miami, Green Bay, Denver, New England, and Buffalo. Lord have mercy on this Jets offense. And, Mekhi Becton, he may or may not be healthy. I mean, this offensive line isn't totally reinforced yet. They picked up Laken Tomlinson, but and like you said, with New England, maybe you don't use, I'm sorry, not New England, Miami, maybe you don't use that capital on Waddle just because with New England, Baltimore, Buffalo to open, it's going to be rough. The takeoff is going to have some turbulence in most cases. It's not like when you have these offenses, right? Because I'm interested again in Jacksonville. You mentioned that offense getting better. The Giants have to be better. Chicago might be better, even though their personnel's not better, but maybe not right away. And the other point you made, which is one to file away, because this is one of my blind spots in fantasy, Andrew, is maybe we're a year early. It's good to get excited about new coaches. It's good to get excited about new schemes, unlocking players. First half of the first year, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But then that creates these buy low opportunities because of understanding that mass psychology of the fantasy market. Even sometimes getting overwhelmed by it gives you that first step to figuring out how to correct it. And it isn't being right. It's just being the first one to realize you're wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very sharp take by you, Sig. Wouldn't expect nothing but the less.
Ah, well, thanks, man. I mean, hey, and if people know that there's sharp takes here, I wanted to talk about that. Give me like 15 seconds on the Detroit offense.
Yeah, so the Lions offense, I mean, they're right in the middle. Their ADP is 16, and I think it's represented that people like the Lions. And when you look at the playmakers they have set up, Swift, Hawkinson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, they drafted Jameson Williams, Jared Goff. He's done it before. Like, when he's been around, good weapons, good, strong offensive line. The Lions, I think, are a team that we could be talking about as a team that does make the leap into this is actually a fantasy-friendly offense.
We realize it during the season. And that's why I'm not a big DeAndre Swift guy, but I'm warming. Isn't he still like a second-round ADP?
Yeah,
right?
He's around there.
I mean, if you want, the thing is, like, I'm not taking DeAndre Swift over CeeDee Lamb. I'm just not going to do that. If Aaron Jones falls the second round, I'm not taking him over Aaron. But I could see Swift working out more as just a chip on the offense, because this offense could take another step forward. You mentioned the offensive line. Always remember offensive line. When you have tackles like they have, when you have, I think, a clarity with their new offensive coordinator, that's one that, and this is one where, as I say, caution, right? Hey, let's not get too ahead of ourselves with these new offenses. But maybe with the Lions, we can, because Ben Johnson kind of took over during the season last year. And Ron-Ra St. Brown took off and gave Johnson the credit. And St. Brown said, we love playing for him. We love playing for this coach. And now you have, and they had a plan. Andrew, did you see the clip with the Lions war room celebrating whenever Olave went number 11?
Yeah.
I mean, they had a plan. They got TJ Chark. They got Jamison Williams very smartly. They know, hey, even if these guys aren't necessarily hitting and Jared Goff's not the best deep ball passer, if we can threaten downfield, that opens up room for us to operate. And they had a plan. And I trust this coaching staff. I trust this team. And we could look back at Detroit as a multiplier offense, like you said. I love the Detroit optimism. The fan base needs it. Before we totally go off the rails, I'm going to be totally self-indulgent here. I don't care if people don't care about baseball. But as a Pirates fan, talk about long-suffering fans. O'Neal Cruz, folks, I mean, an athlete to get excited. I don't care if you don't like baseball. Just go watch this. He's 6'7". He's one of the fastest runners on the team. He had the fastest speed of any Pirate runner in his debut. He threw a 96-mile-an-hour ball across the infield from shortstop. And they asked him if you throw over 100. He's like, you throw 100. He's like, I could probably go over 100. It was the fastest throw any infielder had in baseball this year. And he's 6'7". And he hit a couple of home runs in training and spring training from basically with his knee like 6 inches from the ground. So you can't pitch him low, even though he's 6'7", because he can actually hit home runs when he's almost kneeling. It's exciting. It's really exciting to be a Pirates fan, and I'm going to soak it in. And I hope whatever your team is, you can be excited about them, have some reason to be excited. I want to ask you, Andrew, because I'm an old man and I tried some stuff. You know, I have a law degree. I would call myself a dormant lawyer. I was in information technology systems analyst for years, and I liked doing my fantasy teams better than doing my work. So that's kind of how I ended up here. You're young, you're bright, you have your whole future ahead of you. Why are you in fantasy sports?
I've always just had a love and passion for the game ever since I started my first fantasy league with my dad back in 2007. My aunt, it was a family league. My aunt drafted Tom Brady #1 overall, and we all made fun of her because we all thought taking quarterbacks was stupid. And then we were the ones that looked stupid because he threw for 50 touchdowns that year with Moss, and it was just absolutely bonkers. I just fell in love with the game at that point, and I loved being the manager and making moves and making trades and transactions. I was always a Madden junkie for franchise mode, and that's kind of what got me into playing into like dynasty leagues. And I just wanted to invest more time. And I thought that if I had the opportunity to go into this industry full time, I felt like I could really create a lot of unique and awesome content for people that enjoy the game. And I know I use fantasy as an escape to get away from my tough work environment when I first graduated from college. I studied marketing, and I still use marketing to this day. So my degree is not totally useless, which I'm glad to report on. Thanks, Mom and Dad. And I just was very determined to, this is what I want. Like, I want to grow up. I want to get up in the morning and do something that I'm passionate about. And that was sports for me. And fantasy football was the one thing that was always something on my mind. I would basically race home from my day job and just hop on the computer, writing an article, doing a video. Like, that's all I was thinking about. What was my next thing going to be in fantasy? And just fell in love with the game and continued. And I got the opportunity. And it was really from not necessarily the work I was doing. I was obviously putting in a lot of work, but it was the networking and the building of relationships, as you'll find in any, I'm sure you could attest to this, Sig, that it's all about networking. It's about who you know. Like, that's so critical to making it in any type of industry or any type of space that, blindly sending out your resume, it just doesn't work. Like, it's so far and few between that those things hit, whereas you're probably better off going to a bar, talking to some random stranger, chatting out conversation and building a relationship that way to actually end something that's beneficial to you. You probably have a better chance of doing that. So that's kind of my take on it. And, that's why I love how fantasy has been putting on these networking events, the FSGA, you have the Fantasy Football Expo that's been happening now every single year. Those are just such fun events to get to meet the people that, we go back and forth on Twitter and through the internet. It's fun to kind of put the keyboard warriors aside, put the keyboard swords down, and just kind of like, have fun with everybody. So I love the industry, and I'm just happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's generally an uplifting, positive group of people. And you bring up some words there. I want to examine a little bit more. You bring up networking, you bring up marketing, relationships. I wish I could remember who it was in the Hall of Fame speech that said the NFL is about relationships. It's not just the NFL. Everything is about relationships. And hopefully, how can I say this? Networking is important, as you say, Andrew, but not networking for the networking's sake. The networking that actually is going to take you where your soul and your spirit's going to really flourish is the networking you create when you just are enjoying other people and they're enjoying you, and you're initiating contact and you're being present in it. For the reward is the getting to know the other person, and you taking some sort of joy or delight in understanding another live mind, and mixing, and not with some end in mind. The end is enjoying the time you spend together. That's what we try to do here on the couch every week, huh? But the really, don't. Here's how networking works. Because if you're a nice person, if you're a person that seems very capable, if you're a person that seems like you're generous and giving, a person who, quite simply, who is it that said, I can't remember, it said, you don't remember what people did, you remember how they made you feel, right?
Dr. Seuss.
I don't remember. I don't remember. My brain wants to say like Maya Angelou, but I don't know if that's true. My point is, networking works if you make people feel good when they're around you, right? I mean, I suppose there's another side to networking that is quid pro quo and things like that. And it's like, what can you do for me? What can I do for you? And I'm sure there are people that exist in that, but that's not the networking, the network I want to be in. The network I want to be in are people that, and then if you have a good feeling attached to somebody, then if some opportunity comes up, well, you think of that person because they give you a good feeling, not because you're not networking strategically. Like you mentioned those events, I think the people who do the best networking of those events are the people that are the most enjoyable to be around.
Right.
And that brings me around to marketing. And I don't want to go over, because I don't want to go over an hour because it makes editing harder. But real quick, and I might be asking this question in a way that's loaded without realizing it, so forgive me, Andrew. Okay. How can we make marketing not evil?
Oh man, I would try to say that it need to be more authentic. Would probably be the best way to do it, and not try to be marketing in a way that is kind of not stating the obvious, kind of sneakily marketing things, because that's what a lot of marketing is. It's like,
It's
especially
pushing
nowadays.
buttons. It's pushing emotional and psychological
Yeah.
buttons. And people, I remember when I was at the Newhouse School at Syracuse, that I had friends in the advertising, and the advertising textbook had chapters like using fear to sell things, using envy to sell things. I mean, it's right there. And now we're better and better at hacking people's brains, and you can benefit from that. We're like ATMs. You press the right buttons and the money comes out. It's hard whenever I feel like I'm going to go like off on my reservation here, off the reservation, that I feel like we've made the profit motive sentient, and it's pushed. Now it's calling the shots.
Yeah. No, I think that I would agree with that. But I guess in my benefit, when you do study marketing, you kind of know what they're trying to do to you. So
Yes.
you are able to combat it in that way. But I remember, because it's like, why is this ad falling? It's like, oh, I know I have this ad. I was talking about, buying a suit. So of course I have a suit ad now, like popping up on my screen. Like, of course,
Right.
like that's how it works. So at least having the understanding of like how marketers are attacking you.
Yeah.
Attacking is basically the best way to put it.
Sure.
I think that does, like, educating yourself on, what they're trying to do to you. I mean, at least if you are getting ads that are catered to you, at least the stuff that you're interested in, like at worst.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it can bring you some targeted ad that works, like a T-shirt that's like, yeah, that is actually a T-shirt that I would want. But I think I have an idea for the off season for you, Andrew. If there is an off season, is you can write the book of a marketer's guide to defending yourself from marketing.
Yes.
And how to know, because I think that's like an uplifting way to use that knowledge. And it's wild. You mentioned the thing about, our phones or our Google Assistant or whatever, hearing us say things. And I grew up, there were a lot of dystopia movies, a lot of dystopia books, loved it. I could not get enough, like Logan's Run, Death Takes 2000, Escape from New York, The Terminator, like all this dystopia, right? Philip K. Dick, all the Philip K. Dick movies based on his books. This idea of like the panopticon and constant surveillance and things like that. And the part they didn't get, Andrew, is that we were going to willingly be the actors that made it happen. It's wild. It's wild living long enough to like see how people think the world's going to change, and then seeing how it does change, and what does it mean about us. We learn every week a little bit, something. I hope at least we enjoy our time together. I certainly enjoy the time with Andrew Erickson with K _ Fantasy Pros. Follow him, check him out. And what's up, Matt F. the Oracle, also over there at Fantasy Pros. Always lots of good people that we enjoy spending time with, but most especially, we enjoy spending time with you. we wouldn't be here without you. Enjoy that summer. The summer is here, the solstice, the long days, and we'll be with you through the short days too when fantasy football championships are decided here. Football Guys has so much stuff going on. Check it out if you're thinking about football right now. There's something there for you. And as always, folks, stay classy.